Hi guys, today we'll be reading chapter 9 in A Drop of Mercy. Let's get right into it. After 2 days of steady walking, Heinrich was glad to see the lights shining from Uncle Samuel's window. Well, if it isn't Abram and Heinrich, what a surprise! Aunt Esther said from the open kitchen door as they approached the front steps. Ah, look at the two of yous, a sight for aching eyes if I ever had them. Though my eyes are as good as the day the good God gave them to me. Don't stand out in that cold air. Come in. As they stepped into the kitchen, Uncle Samuel greeted them warmly. It's so very good to see you. Come into the stube and put your feet up. Heinrich followed his father into the large, homey stove room. And how's little John? Dottie asked, patting the head of the toddler peeking around his mother's skirts. More than enough for this mother to keep up with, Aunt Esther said. Thank the good God he sent the other 3 first, for it takes all of us to watch this one. She patted the child's blonde hair in turn. Right, little man? What is he now, 10 months, 11? 15 going on 20. Come, have a seat. Uncle Samuel gestured to the wooden chairs facing the flat rectangular jam stove attached to the backside of the kitchen chimney and fed by its coals. Wonder why we didn't put one of these things in our house, Dottie said. All the heat of the fire, but none of the smoke. It's ingenious. Uncle Samuel chuckled. You'd have to attach your kitchen to the house first. That we would. 9-year-old Dirk scooted his chair close enough to Heinrich's to speak over the men's conversation. Did you see that aurora borealis last night? I did. It was something. It lasted 15 minutes. I timed it. Peter Reif, he's our near neighbor, he says it was so red because there's going to be a big battle soon. Dottie says Peter doesn't know what he's talking about. You should listen to your Dottie. That's what Greta says. Are there lots of soldiers in Germantown? Some. Who do you like better, Washington's men or the King's? They're about the same. But which do you like best? Leave Heinrich alone, Greta said. He doesn't care to be interrogated like a spy. Dirk waved his hand. He likes war stuff, don't you, Hein? Heinrich sent Greta a grateful glance as he answered his exuberant young cousin. I'm rather tired. I think I might just sit and listen to the men for a while. Dirk looked disappointed, and Heinrich knew he'd won only a temporary reprieve. He turned his attention to the men's discussion. Uncle Samuel was speaking about his bishop, Christian Funk. He used to be one of the staunchest men among us. Wouldn't even think of supporting the Liberty men. Then, one day, he goes to one of their meetings and comes out saying maybe they just have a point after all. Dottie's eyebrow shot up. He says we should support the rebellion? Not support it exactly. More like we shouldn't think of them as rebels anymore. Says maybe they really are the new government. And if they are, well, then we should obey them, same as we do the king. And what do we do about the king? Christian only says we might need to obey the rebels. He doesn't say anything about the king. I guess we should obey them both. Dottie stroked his beard and pondered that thought. 'Twould be rather hard to accomplish, given the difference of opinion between the two. You've nailed that one on the head. Half the church sides with Meyer and Hershey, and the other half with Funk. And those of us who don't know which way to choose are sitting in the middle, hoping it all turns out well. Though I will say it's somewhat better now that they've told Christian not to preach. Still, he talks to whoever will listen. Tries to convince them that paying the fine is not a bad thing. Says the good Lord would pay it himself if he were here, since it's Congresses who printed the money in the first place, and it would only be rendering unto Caesar. It's a mess, I tell you. I'll be glad to see this war over, no matter which side wins, so long as we get back to living our peaceful and godly lives like we've always done. Heinrich felt a tug on the leg of his breeches. It was little John. He instinctively reached out and drew the toddler onto his lap. Hey there, lambkin, what you doing? Aunt Esther looked surprised. Look at that. Normally he cries if anyone but me tries to take him. You must have the touch. Dottie teasingly held his nose. It's the smell. John petted Heinrich's aspiring beard and giggled. Or the fur, Heinrich said. He seems to notice I'm not half the man I could be. The group joined in a comfortable laugh. Family. It was good. Well, Dottie said, standing up and stretching, I imagine you children are wondering what your gifts are. Or did you think your aunt had forgotten to pack them?" 12-year-old Sarah looked bashfully at her hands. Greta sat erect and feigned indifference. She was nearly 16 after all. Dirk jumped off his seat. "She would never forget us." "Of course she wouldn't." Dottie fetched his satchel from the kitchen, pulled out 2 bundles of neatly folded linen, and handed them to the girls. "Aunt Eleanor said you would know which one belongs to who." The girls unfolded the matching towels, identical, but for the design embroidered across the top, and quickly swapped gifts. "I love morning glories," Sarah said. "And butterflies have always been my favorite." Greta fingered the delicate design traced in fine blue stitches. Beside Heinrich, Dirk bounced excitedly as Dottie dug for the next gift. "And this," he said, drawing out the announcement, "is for you, Esther." Esther took the wooden box with a laugh and untied the green ribbon that held the lid shut. "Sugar! Wherever in the world? Samuel, look, white sugar! There must be a dozen cones. Oh, Abram, do tell Eleanor a huge thank you for me. We haven't had sugar in ever so long. Well, we've had maple sugar to be sure, but not white sugar. Oh, thank you." Heinrich couldn't help but notice Dirk. The boy was nearly bursting with anticipation. He held in his chuckle when Dottie bypassed Dirk yet again and handed the next gift to Uncle Samuel. A pair of shoes, thickly soled and never worn. Samuel looked close to tears. Did Esther send word? Heinrich watched as the 2 older men held their emotions in check. He remembered the day they got news that a band of roaming militia had tied Samuel to a tree and taunted him as they stripped the house of all the food and blankets they could carry. Mom had choked back the tears that day, too, as she had read the letter aloud. They had stolen the shoes right off Samuel's feet, it said, then had the gall to take off with his horse and wagon. You don't take a farmer's horse. Never. Samuel held the shoes close, as if they might run away on their own accord. "Thank you," he said. "I will use these well." Dottie cleared his throat and made a show of reaching deep into the bag. "Yeah, well, I'm sure there's something else in here." Dirk bounced on the edge of his chair, then deflated when he saw the items in his uncle's hands. "Ah, yes, a tot-sized trencher and a spoon for little John." Heinrich was actually starting to feel sorry for his cousin, but since everyone else had already gotten a gift, Dirk was sure to get his soon. Dottie said, looking at Dirk at last. "You've grown up a lot this last year, young man. I suppose you've about outgrown gifts." "No, Uncle Abram, I'm not that old yet. I still like gifts a lot." "You do? Well, then perhaps you're not old enough for a jackknife." "Oh, I'm very careful with knives, aren't I, Dottie?" Heinrich held back his laughter. Uncle Samuel grinned. "You are the most careful of all my sons." "Then I guess this is for you." Dottie pulled out a bone-handled jackknife, almost identical to Heinrich's, and handed it to the boy. "A Barlow!" Dirk opened and closed the knife several times, turning to each person in the circle to make sure they saw he truly held his very own Barlow knife. Finally, he turned to Heinrich. "Will you show me how to make an Indian broom?" Heinrich pulled out his own knife and held it up for comparison. "I think that could be arranged." Dirk nabbed Heinrich immediately after breakfast the next morning to help him select just the right hemlock branches for his broom. They sat together on the front porch and stripped the finer twigs from the branches. The needles would fall off on their own accord in a day or two. Heinrich held the twigs in a tight bundle, while Dirk wound the twine several times around to hold them together. "That ought to be tight enough," he said. "Now get your handle." Dirk picked up the long handle he had whittled to a sharp point at one end. "What you have to do now is shove the handle right in the middle of this bunch like this," Heinrich demonstrated. Dirk did as he was instructed and beamed as he held up his first broom. Heinrich nodded with appreciation. "Nice." Uncle Samuel poked his head around the corner of the house. "We got the oxen hitched up. You two want to come help with the threshing?" "Yeah," Dirk said, quickly tucking away his knife. Heinrich followed along. Uncle Samuel's barn was big enough for threshing indoors. Heinrich was intrigued by his setup. The swing beam attached to a single point in the central beam of the roof and could freely turn in a continuous circle. The huge pair of Devon oxen, yoked to this beam, would walk that circle for hours, pulling the heavy threshing board behind them. Bundles of wheat thrown on the floor in front of them would then be trampled repeatedly, first by their hooves, then by the board, until the grains separated from the chaff. All the men had to do was remove the wheat once it had been trampled and thrown down new bundles. They could winnow it on some later day. "You want to hop on?" Samuel asked. It was the invitation Dirk had been waiting for. "Come on, Hein." Dirk pulled at his cousin. Heinrich shook his head. That was children's play. He'd rather help the men keep the floor supplied with new stalks. Dirk took the goad from his father and hopped onto the board. "Gehen!" he yelled. And the oxen commenced their slow and steady walk to nowhere. "That's a beautiful pair of animals," Heinrich said to his uncle. "They seem well matched. You train them yourself?" "Yes. It took them a while to figure out the circle, though. They're used to pulling the plow, straight and fast. They have to go slower on the beam here, and the circle is uneven. See how the outer path is longer than the inner one? Well, the follower, that's the inner one there with the smaller horns, he's used to matching his speed to the leader. Hard to do that in a circle, but they figured it out. I'd love to see them work in the field." "I'm sure you will. If they're not plowing, they're hauling lumber or pulling up brambles. Hardly seems a day comes but they're helping me with something. Even more so now with the horse gone." The next day was the Lord's Day, so the family gathered at the table for meeting right after breakfast. The Salford congregation gathered at the meeting house only twice a month, and this was the stay-at-home week. Uncle Samuel handed Dottie the family's bulky German Bible, 4 inches across the spine and printed in Germantown by Christopher Sauer, along with a magnifying glass to read the text in the dimly lit room. Dottie gently flipped through the pages. Perhaps the book of James would be good to ponder this morning," he said, then launched into reading the entire book, all 5 chapters. Heinrich tried to keep his mind on the passage, for he truly cared what God wanted to say to him, but his mind kept wandering to that splendid team of Devons in the barn. "The trying of your faith works patience," Dottie read. "Those beasts will walk around the same circle for hours on end, never seeming to notice that they've never left the room. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. That must be how they know which one is the boss and which one is the follower. And the follower actually follows. Smarter than a lot of people. The wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Who ever saw such workers? On and on they go day after day, leaning into the ground, using the weight of their massive bodies to force the load behind them. Magnificent. If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, Depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit?" What was that? "From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your lusts that war in your members?" Heinrich flinched. "From my own lusts." "Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be afflicted and mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to heaviness. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." Exposed. Undone. Oh, dear God. There was no way for a man as defiled as he to cleanse his hands, let alone purify his soul. Only mourning and heaviness for him. So you see here, I think that Heinrich is feeling the guilt of not having had mercy on the soldier, and so we're starting to see God is working pretty delicately, but pretty strongly in Heinrich's soul. And so if you tune in again next week, we'll see what happens after that. Hope you have a good week. Bye.